The temperature showed no mercy as it plunged to negative 18 degrees Celsius. In the heart of a snow-covered forest, 8 bear cubs huddled together, their small bodies resembling tiny mounds beneath the accumulating snowfall. Each passing minute brought more flakes, clinging to their fur and making them tremble even harder. Their cries pierced the frigid air, 8 desperate voices calling for the same thing: their mother. The youngest cub could barely keep his eyes open. His legs trembled so violently that his older siblings had to press against him, helping him stay upright. His sister tried shaking the snow from her back, but it was a futile effort. The relentless snowfall covered them again and again. Their breaths formed small white clouds that vanished almost instantly into the dark, icy air. These 8 cubs had never been alone before. Their mother had always been there, her large, warm body shielding them from the cold, her presence banishing their fears. But now the forest loomed vast and empty around them. Their stomachs ached with hunger, and the freezing wind nipped at their ears and noses. Still, they remained where they were, holding on to the lesson their mother had taught them. If they were ever separated, they must wait. The eldest cub tried to be strong. He moved around his siblings, nudging them closer together in an attempt to keep them warm, but deep inside he was just as frightened as the rest. His own cry soon joined theirs, a deep, sorrowful sound that echoed through the silent trees. As night drew near, their calls grew more desperate. Some cubs whimpered in high, frightened tones, while others let out deep, mournful cries that made the forest feel even lonelier. Yet just that morning, everything had been different. They had woken up feeling safe and warm, nestled in their mother's thick fur. For weeks, she had been preparing them for winter, teaching them how to find food beneath the snow, how to stay close to one another, and how to keep warm. She had been their guide, her patient eyes watching over them as they explored their home in the vast, frozen wilderness. None of them could have known that this day would test everything she had taught them. The morning had begun like any other. Their mother had led them through their daily routine, showing them how to brush aside the snow to uncover the last hidden berries of the season. She had demonstrated which tree bark they could eat when food became scarce, and how to recognize ice sturdy enough to walk on. The cubs had followed her eagerly, their tiny paws leaving delicate tracks in the fresh snow, trailing behind her much larger ones. Then something changed. Their mother's head suddenly lifted, her nose twitching in the icy air. Something was wrong. Her entire body tensed, her posture rigid as she scanned the dense forest ahead. The cubs watched as she paced back and forth, eyes fixed on the distant tree line where the woods grew darker. She had never behaved like this before. Low warning sounds rumbled in her throat, instructing them to stay close. The smallest cub pressed against her leg, feeling the muscles beneath her thick fur tremble with tension. Then came the noise that changed everything. It wasn't a forest sound, not like the crack of ice on branches or the call of winter birds. This sound was different, something that didn't belong in their world. Their mother's eyes had grown wide with fear, her ears turning in all directions as she tried to track where the sound was coming from. She had quickly led them to a small dip in the ground, covered by thick bushes. Using her nose, she had gently pushed them together, making sure they were hidden from view. The cubs had watched in confusion as their mother stepped away. She looked back at them one last time, her eyes filled with worry. Then she had disappeared into the white forest, moving quickly, as if she was trying to lead something away from where her cubs were hiding. That was the last time they had seen her. The snow had started falling shortly after, slowly covering her tracks until there was no sign she had ever been there. Hours passed slowly. The cubs waited patiently at first, sure that their mother would return any minute. But as the sun moved across the sky, their patience turned to worry. The temperature kept dropping, and the snow started falling faster. Their hiding place, which had felt safe in the morning, now felt like a cold trap. The wind found its way through the bushes, making them huddle closer together for warmth. As the day wore on, hunger began to gnaw at their bellies. Their mother usually would have found them food by now. The smallest cub tried to remember what she had taught them about finding berries under the snow, but he was too scared to leave the group. Besides, the snow was falling so heavily now that any berries would be buried too deep to find. The bitter cold crept in slowly at first, then with growing cruelty. As afternoon faded into early evening, the temperature plummeted to negative 18 degrees Celsius, turning the forest into a frozen wasteland. The 8 bear cubs, still huddled in their hiding spot, were now fighting a battle against winter itself. Their fur, usually thick enough for winter days, couldn't protect them from this extreme cold. Snow had started to build up on their backs, making them look like living snowdrifts. The second smallest cub started shivering so violently that his teeth chattered, making a sound that scared his siblings. His sister, just slightly bigger than him, pressed closer, trying to share what little warmth she had left. But it wasn't enough. The cold had become a living thing, searching for any gap between them to sink its icy teeth in. Their paws, still too soft and young for such harsh conditions, had begun to ache from standing in the deep snow. One of the middle cubs remembered how their mother would sometimes dig into the snow to make a warmer space for them to rest. He started pawing at the ground, his small claws scraping against the frozen earth. 2 of his brothers joined in, their movements desperate and clumsy. But the ground was too hard, frozen solid by weeks of winter. Their efforts only tired them more, making them breathe harder in the frigid air. The oldest cub tried to take charge, just as he had seen their mother do. He nudged his siblings, encouraging them to move around a little to keep their blood flowing. But fear had frozen them in place as much as the cold had. Each step away from their hiding spot felt like giving up hope that their mother would return. The smallest ones had started to cry, their weak voices carrying across the snow-covered forest. As the wind picked up strength, it brought new sounds that made their hearts race with fear. Strange creaks and groans echoed through the trees. Branches heavy with snow and ice swayed dangerously above them. One crashed down nearby, making them all jump and cry out in terror. Their hiding place no longer felt safe, but they were too scared to leave it. Hunger made everything worse. Their last meal had been early that morning, and their young bodies weren't used to going so long without food. The oldest cub spotted some bark on a nearby tree, the kind their mother had shown them they could eat, but it was too high for any of them to reach. He stood on his back legs, stretching as far as he could, but his claws barely scratched the tree's surface. The cubs' cries grew louder as darkness began to creep through the forest. Each of them called out in their own way, some with high, piercing whimpers, others with deep, mournful sounds. Together, their voices created a chorus of desperation that echoed through the frozen woods. But no answering call came. No heavy footsteps crunched through the snow toward them. No warm, familiar shape appeared through the falling snowflakes. The smallest cub had stopped shivering, which worried his older siblings. Their mother had taught them that shivering meant the body was trying to stay warm. So what did it mean when the shivering stopped? They pressed against him from all sides, trying to share their remaining body heat. His eyes had grown heavy, and he fought to keep them open. Each breath he took seemed slower than the last. As darkness crept deeper into the forest, fear began to take control of the 8 cubs' minds. Each shadow looked like a moving creature. Each whisper of wind sounded like footsteps. The youngest cubs had stopped crying, too tired and cold to make any more noise. Only their quick, shallow breathing showed they were still awake. The darkness brought new terrors they had never faced before. Without their mother's protective presence, every night sound became a threat. An owl's sudden call made them all flinch and press closer together. They had seen owls before, but always from the safety of their mother's side. Now the sharp sound reminded them of how small and helpless they really were. The third oldest cub started trembling, but not from cold. He had spotted 2 gleaming eyes in the darkness between the trees. His fear spread quickly to the others as they too noticed the watching creature. None of them knew what it was, but they remembered their mother's warnings about other animals that hunted in the forest. The cubs tried to make themselves as small as possible, hoping their snow-covered bodies would blend into the white ground. Minutes felt like hours as they waited, frozen with fear. The eyes finally disappeared, but the terror remained. The cubs' minds filled with images of all the dangerous animals their mother had taught them about: wolves, mountain lions, and other bears bigger than themselves. In their mother's absence, every rustle of branches became a potential predator. The oldest cub tried to be brave, but his own fear betrayed him. When a branch cracked somewhere in the darkness, he jumped just like the others. His siblings had always looked to him for strength, just as they all looked to their mother. But now he felt as scared and lost as they were. His attempts to comfort the others grew weaker as his own courage failed. Their world had shrunk to this small, snow-covered spot in the forest. The cubs no longer thought about finding food or getting warm. They thought only about surviving until morning. Each minute that passed without their mother's return chipped away at their hope. The smallest cub had stopped responding when his siblings nudged him, though they could still feel his heart beating fast with fear. In the depths of their fear and cold, something remarkable began to happen. The 8 cubs, driven by instinct and love for each other, started working together in ways their mother would have been proud to see. The oldest cub remembered how their mother would arrange them for sleep on cold nights, with the smallest cubs in the middle and the larger ones on the outside. Gently, he began pushing and nudging his siblings into a tight circle. The 2 smallest cubs, who had grown dangerously quiet, were moved to the center where they could get the most warmth. The bigger cubs took turns on the outside, each facing a different direction like their mother had taught them. They couldn't fight the cold alone, but together they could share what little warmth they had left. The second oldest cub noticed her smallest brother's eyes starting to close. She remembered how their mother would groom their fur to keep them awake when they were tired. Using the last of her energy, she began licking the snow off his face and ears. 2 other cubs joined in, working together to keep the snow from building up on their siblings' fur. Their tongues were tired and cold, but they didn't stop. One of the middle cubs started making soft, rumbling sounds, similar to the comforting noises their mother would make when they were scared. Though his voice was much smaller than their mother's, the familiar sound helped calm his brothers and sisters. Soon, other cubs joined in, their combined humming creating a gentle vibration that helped them feel less alone. The 5th cub discovered that by stamping his paws rhythmically, he could keep his feet from freezing to the snow. He showed his siblings, and soon all 8 cubs were carefully lifting and lowering their paws in turn. It wasn't much, but it helped keep their blood flowing. When one cub got too tired to move, another would nudge them gently, encouraging them to keep going. As the night grew colder, their teamwork became more crucial. They took turns being on the outside of their circle, making sure no single cub had to face the bitter wind for too long. When the smallest cub started crying again from hunger and cold, his siblings pressed closer, sharing their body heat and their strength. They had never needed each other more than they did now. The night brought new dangers that tested the cubs' fragile unity. A strong wind began to howl through the trees, picking up loose snow and throwing it like tiny sharp needles against their faces. The cubs had to squint their eyes to protect them from the stinging snow, making the darkness feel even deeper and scarier. Above them, the heavy branches began to sway dangerously. The sound of cracking wood echoed through the forest as the wind grew stronger. A large branch, weighed down by ice and snow, suddenly crashed down just feet away from their huddled group. The cubs jumped in terror, their protective circle almost breaking apart. The oldest cub quickly nudged them back together, but the fear had set deep into their bones. The wind carved passed through the snow, creating deep drifts around them. The white powder was now piled so high that it reached the smaller cub's shoulders. If they stayed in this spot much longer, the snow would bury them completely. But moving meant leaving the place where their mother had left them, and that thought terrified them more than the rising snow. A new sound cut through the howling wind, the distant howl of wolves. The cubs froze, their hearts beating faster. Their mother had always led them away when she heard wolf calls, but now they had nowhere to go. The howls seemed to come from all directions, bouncing off the trees and snowbanks until the cubs couldn't tell where the real danger might be. The temperature dropped even lower, making the air itself feel like ice in their lungs. Breathing became painful, each intake of the frigid air burning their throats. The smallest cub had started making wheezing sounds that scared his siblings. His breath came out in tiny puffs that grew weaker with each passing minute. The ice was forming on their whiskers now, making tiny clinking sounds when they moved their heads. In the darkest hours before dawn, the cubs reached their breaking point. The smallest cub collapsed into the snow, his legs no longer able to hold him up. His siblings tried desperately to keep him standing, pushing against his sides, but he barely responded to their touch. His eyes were barely open, showing only a tiny glint in the darkness. The second smallest cub began to sway on her feet, her body trembling so violently that she couldn't stay in the protective circle. Each time her siblings pressed close to steady her, she would stumble in a different direction. The cold had confused her mind. She kept turning her head from side to side, as if she could no longer remember where she was or why they were there. Panic spread through the group as they watched their weakest siblings failing. The older cubs tried desperately to remember everything their mother had taught them about surviving cold nights, but nothing seemed to help anymore. Their own strength was fading fast, their bodies stiff from standing so long in the freezing snow. The wolf howls grew closer, sounding more hungry and confident. One particularly loud howl made the cubs tremble with fear. The oldest cub tried to stand tall and look brave, but his legs were shaking too badly. He could barely keep his own eyes open, let alone protect his brothers and sisters. For the first time, he let out a cry that wasn't just calling for their mother. It was a cry of pure despair. 3 of the middle cubs started stumbling in circles, their minds confused by the cold and fear. They bumped into each other, breaking the protective circle that had kept them alive so far. The group's unity began to crumble as exhaustion and cold overcame their will to stay together. Some cubs started wandering a few steps away, their minds too numb to remember why they needed to stay close. The forest around them had become a frozen nightmare. Ice crystals floated in the air, reflecting what little light there was, making it look like the darkness itself was sparkling. But this beauty was deadly. Each sparkle meant another drop in temperature, another step closer to freezing. Just when all hope seemed lost, a sound different from the howling wind caught their attention. Through the darkness came a deep, familiar call, one that made all 8 cubs' ears perk up at once. It was distant but unmistakable, their mother's voice. The sound rolled through the forest like thunder, powerful and filled with determination. The smallest cub, who had been lying motionless in the snow, lifted his head slightly. His siblings, who had started to wander apart, froze in their tracks. Even in their confused, cold-numb state, they all recognized that sound. It was the call that had always meant safety, warmth, and love. Their mother was searching for them. The oldest cub gathered his last bit of strength and let out a loud cry in response. One by one, his siblings joined in, their combined voices rising above the wind. Their calls were weak compared to hours earlier, but they put every last bit of energy into making themselves heard. The smallest cubs could only manage quiet whimpers, but even these added to their desperate chorus. The wolf howls that had been getting closer suddenly stopped. The cub's mother called again, closer this time, her voice carrying a warning that made the whole forest fall silent. The sound of heavy paws crushing through snow reached their ears, moving faster and faster. Through the swirling snowflakes, a large, dark shape began to emerge. The cubs trembled, but this time not from cold or fear, but from hope. Their mother burst through the snowy darkness like a force of nature. In seconds, she was among them, her large body shielding them from the bitter wind, her warm fur pressing against their frozen bodies. She quickly gathered all 8 cubs close, checking each one with gentle nudges of her nose. The smallest cub, nearly lost to the cold, she picked up carefully in her mouth. Moving swiftly, she led them to a nearby cave, one she had prepared during her absence. Inside, the air was warmer, protected from the howling wind. Dried leaves and soft pine needles covered the ground, creating a nest away from the cold stone floor. One by one, she groomed her cubs, licking the snow from their fur, helping warm blood flow back into their tired bodies. As the first light of dawn painted the sky outside their cave, all 8 cubs lay snuggled against their mother's warm body, finally safe and warm. Their long night of fear and cold was over. They had survived by staying together, by helping each other, and by never giving up hope. Though they were too young to understand it, their bond as siblings had grown stronger through their ordeal, just like the first rays of sunlight now growing stronger outside their cave. This story of 8 bear cubs' survival reminds us how precious and fragile wildlife is in our changing world. Their struggle against extreme cold and their will to survive highlights the challenges many wild animals face during harsh winters. As our climate becomes more unpredictable and human activities increasingly impact natural habitats, it's crucial to protect these vulnerable creatures and their homes. Every small action we take to preserve their environment, from supporting wildlife conservation to being mindful of our impact on forest areas, helps ensure that future generations of bear cubs will have safe places to grow, learn, and thrive with their mothers. Their story is not just about survival. It's a call for us to become better guardians of our natural world.